It's a tiny piece of a much, much bigger story. Let's dive in.
I want you to picture this. It's a calm morning. Maybe you're on the coast, but then you see something on the horizon. These sleek, fast ships with terrifying dragon heads carved right on the front, just slicing through the water. Before you know it, warriors with axes and shields are pouring onto the shore. For a lot of people, this was their first terrifying introduction to the Vikings.
So yeah, that image of the brutal raider, it's been burned into our minds for centuries. But is that the whole story? Were they just about destruction, or is there something more to these people from the north? That's really the big question we're going to tackle.
Okay, to really get the true story, we need to peel back the layers and figure out who we're even talking about. It's time to go way beyond that simple stereotype. All right, this first point is absolutely crucial. Viking wasn't a nationality. It was more like a job description. The word itself basically meant to go on an expedition. So while these folks came from Scandinavia, not every Scandinavian was a Viking. It was a path you chose, whether you were a warrior, a trader, or an explorer looking for fame and fortune. Now, of course, you can't talk about Vikings without talking about the raids. I mean, this is how they exploded onto the world scene. This is how they built that fearsome reputation that would literally last for 1,000 years. And what's interesting is that the Viking Age has a really clear start and a pretty definite end. It all kicks off with one shocking event in 793 AD. Then for almost 300 years, it's nonstop action across Europe. And it all wraps up just as dramatically in 1066.
That big event was the raid on a monastery called Lindisfarne, right off the coast of England. Now you might be wondering, why a monastery? Well, think about it. Monasteries back then were packed with treasure, gold, silver, jewels, but they were also full of monks, not soldiers. They were basically unguarded banks, making them the perfect target. This one attack sent shockwaves across all of Europe.
So how in the world do they pull off these incredible raids? What was their secret weapon? It all comes down to their amazing technology, the longship. These things were true marvels of engineering. They were fast, they could handle the open ocean, but, and this is the genius part, they were also shallow enough to sail way upriver, striking deep into lands no one thought were vulnerable. It was a total game changer.
But the story of that longship isn't just about destruction. It's also a story of creation. It's about trade, about building new homes, and about exploring. And honestly, this is where the Viking story goes from interesting to absolutely fascinating. They started building new worlds, not just raiding old ones.
You see, the Vikings didn't always just hit and run. A lot of the time, they came to stay. In France, they settled the region that became known as Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. In England, they took over a huge chunk of the country called the Danelaw. And over in the east, Swedish Vikings helped create the very first state in the area we now call Russia and Ukraine. They weren't just raiders, they were nation builders.
And their ambition didn't just stop at the edges of Europe, not even close. With their amazing ships and a serious thirst for discovery, they started pushing the boundaries of the entire known world.
And this number, this just blows my mind. Around the year 1000, an explorer named Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland and landed in North America. He called it Vinland. That's almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus ever set sail. They were the first Europeans we know of to ever set foot in the Americas. Just think about that.
So, after centuries of all this raiding, trading, and exploring, what happened? I mean, every era has to end, right? But the impact the Vikings left behind? Well, it changed the map of the world forever.
The year 1066 is usually seen as the symbolic endpoint. The Viking king of Norway, a guy named Harald Hardrada, tried to invade England and was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. By then, the Scandinavian kingdoms were becoming more like the rest of Europe, and the great age of raiding was pretty much over.
But their legacy? Wow, it's immense. They connected the world with trade routes stretching from Canada to the Middle East. They were masters of navigation, they founded kingdoms, and they even changed the way we talk. The English language is full of words that came from Old Norse, words like sky, egg, law, even window. So when we think of Vikings, we have to look past the stereotype. These were explorers who discovered a continent, traders who connected cultures, and settlers who laid the groundwork for modern nations. Which kind of leaves us with one last question. If they did all of that, why is the first thing we think of the horns on their helmets, which, by the way, they never actually wore? It's definitely something to think about. Let's talk about the Vikings. When you hear that name, you probably picture those epic warriors with the
Imagine a quiet, misty coastline. Life is slow, it's predictable, it's peaceful. And then, out on the horizon, a shape cuts through the waves. A dragon's head. Then another, and another. A storm is coming, but it's not a storm of wind and rain. It's a storm of men. You know, for almost 300 years, that scene was a terrifying reality all across Europe. The sight of those longships meant your world was about to be completely turned upside down. But who were these people, really? These raiders from the frozen north? What were they actually after? Well, let's pull back the mist and get to the truth behind the legend. To really get a grip on their impact, we first have to understand who they were. And believe me, they weren't just this single destructive force. They were a really complex people coming from a land of, well, ice and fire.
Right, so here's the first thing you have to get your head around. The word Viking, it wasn't really who you were, it was what you did. It was like a job description. And sure, they were absolutely fearsome warriors, but that's not the whole story. They were also incredibly shrewd traders looking for new markets, and they were, without a doubt, some of the greatest explorers the world has ever seen. So they came from Scandinavia, right? From these rugged fjords and deep, dark forests. It was a harsh place to live, resources could be tight, and if you were young and ambitious, well, the sea was your ticket. It was a path to glory, to wealth, and to new lands.
Historians love to put bookends on things, and the Viking Age is no different. We usually frame it between two huge events. It kicks off with this shocking, brutal raid that sent a wave of terror through Europe, and it wraps up with one final epic clash for the English throne. So let's start at the very beginning. The year is 793. Viking longships land on a small, holy island off the coast of England called Lindisfarne. They stormed the monastery, a place that was completely undefended. They killed the monks, and they took everything of value. Now, this wasn't just a robbery. It was a message. A new power was on the scene, and it played by a whole different set of rules. The Viking Age had just begun, in blood and fire. So you gotta ask yourself, how did a relatively small group of people from the very edge of the known world manage to strike fear into hearts so far away? The answer wasn't just about how fierce they were, it was about their single greatest piece of technology. The longship was an absolute masterpiece of naval engineering. Seriously, its genius was its versatility. Because it had this shallow draft, it could land on almost any beach, which meant total surprise. But it was also tough enough to cross the open ocean, yet sleek enough to sail way, way up shallow rivers, hitting towns and cities that thought they were perfectly safe. It was, honestly, the ultimate weapon of its time. And with those longships, literally no one on the coast was safe. From Ireland to Russia, even all the way down into the Mediterranean, the Vikings raided. They were fast, they were brutal, and they seemed completely unstoppable. They built a reputation for terror that would last for generations. But, and this is a huge but, if we only think of the Vikings as raiders, we're missing like half the story. The raid was often just the first act. What came next was settlement and trade and building entirely new societies. See, the Vikings didn't always just take the loot and go home. A lot of the time, they stayed. They founded cities like Dublin and Ireland. They took control of a massive chunk of England called the Danelaw. They even sailed down the rivers of Eastern Europe and set up trade routes to Constantinople, becoming the rulers of the local Slavic tribes, who actually called them the Rus. If you want a perfect example of how they adapted, look no further than a chieftain named Rollo. This guy terrorized the coast of France so relentlessly that the French king basically threw up his hands and offered him a deal. He said, look, I'll give you this huge piece of land if you promise to defend it from other Vikings. Rollo took the deal, and that land, it became Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. And his descendants, well, they'd eventually go on to conquer England. So what was driving all this? Well, you have to look at what they believed. Their gods, like Odin, the wise and cunning All-Father, or Thor, the powerful god of thunder. They weren't just stories. They were a core part of a worldview where your fate was already sealed, and the greatest honor you could have was to die in battle and earn your seat in Valhalla. Of course, all ages have to end. The very forces the Vikings unleashed on the world eventually changed them and changed the world they lived in. So, how did this massive storm from the north finally begin to fade? The year 1066. That's the date most historians point to as the end. In that year, the king of Norway, a guy named Harald Hardrada, who is often called the last great Viking, invaded England to try and take the crown. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And with his death, the great age of Viking expansion was pretty much over. But here's the thing. Their story didn't just stop. It's woven into our story now. It's in the DNA of millions of people. It's in the names of towns and cities all over Europe. It's even in the words we use every single day. Think about it. Thursday? That's Thursday. The word window? It comes from the Old Norse for wind-eye. They didn't just attack Europe, they became part of its fabric. And maybe the most incredible part of their story was hidden for centuries. Because long before Columbus ever set sail, Viking explorers like Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and landed in North America, which leaves us with this one last incredible thought. What if these Scandinavian seafarers weren't just Europe's most feared raiders, but also its greatest, and for centuries its most forgotten explorers?